out some way, right? Right? As a wise elder, someone who's cultivated personal excellence over a long life, you know, he might say, no, we got to figure out a third way. We don't know what that third way is, but we're going to keep everyone on this boat. Yeah.
Draw straws.
Yeah.
Tie a rope around one, let him float.
Well, the drawing straw wouldn't work because the dog wouldn't understand it. Right? That would be an unfair test.
So you tie a rope around the waist of somebody and throw them overboard and let them swim and just alternate people.
The dog can have the leftovers.
I don't know. Yeah. Well, yeah. If one of them is, you know, Dick Cheney and, you know, Donald Rumsfeld and Rush Limbaugh, right? That's an easy choice. You know, you keep Roy on board, off you go. You're worthless. No. That would be obviously the philosopher. The beauty of this, if somehow Regan is giving us some right answers here, that's kind of a relief, isn't it? Because it means we have a test other than our own subjective, other than what culture taught us or how we grew up thinking our prejudices. Isn't that refreshing? Isn't that kind of what we're all looking for? Some reason for, to act. A moral norm that is not just built out on a house of sand, right? You don't want a moral norm built on a house of sand, right? Cultures are houses of sand. They change all the time, right? You don't want a moral norm built on, then you would be saying that, look, if moral norms are just the same as culture, if there's nowhere deeper than culture that you can go, then you have to conclude that in Nazi Germany, the morally correct course of action was to get on the phone and call an authority when you discovered that the person living next door was living under an alias and in fact was Jewish, right? You were morally obligated to do that in Nazi Germany. You were a bad person if you didn't call the authorities, right? Does that mean that calling the authorities and turning in the Jewish person was the morally right thing to do? No, of course not. Their culture was deeply flawed. The same way the culture that tolerated slavery in the United States was deeply flawed, right? It's refreshing, right? Because we want to go down this road toward looking for a universal explanation for condemning slavery or for condemning prejudice, concentration camps for people, right? And the deontologists give it to us, right? They give us these objective reasons for asserting, and now we have an objective test, right? And we can all submit to the objectivity of this test, okay? And we can decide without ruffling any feathers. In the end, everyone's going to understand. Everyone's going to be on board, right? Because we're going to come up with the one course of action which is universalizable. Okay. So in the chimpanzee heart example, Regan might argue, okay, this may be what he's saying. He may be saying that it's okay to instrumentalize the chimp because there are vital human needs at stake. Okay? And according to his worse off principle, the human is going to be worse off than the chimpanzee, and so the vital interest of the human is going to trump the vital interest of the chimpanzee. Okay? That may be what Regan's saying. He also may be saying, though, something more stringent, namely that it is not okay. It's okay in the instance of the lifeboat because there you have no choice but to instrumentalize one of those 5 beings, right, who are all subjects of lives. But in this case, Regan might say it's not okay because killing the chimp for the human entails completely instrumentalizing the chimp, whereas refusing to kill the chimp does not entail instrumentalization of the human or anybody else, or the chimpanzee or anybody. So, do not instrumentalize. This is a really important point, okay? And this is how the animal, this might be our answer to, if we support the notion of animal rights, then this may be our answer to that quandary, right? And it may not be the kind of answer that your family members at Thanksgiving want to hear, because it's kind of a radical notion, right? What do you mean? You mean if we know that killing that animal over there is going to save the human, we're not allowed? What do you mean? Where'd you learn that? You need to just stop going to college. I didn't send you to college to learn that, right? Anyway, but But, there's something, again, though, there's something refreshing, in my view. Maybe I'm somewhat odd in this respect, but there's something refreshing because, and the notion here is that there's a natural order of reason, okay? And our moral obligations are identified. We learn of our moral obligations by understanding the natural order of reason, okay? And in the natural order of reason, if you're all humans at the very least, right? That's what Kant is saying. In the natural order of reason, all humans are ends in themselves. Okay? And that's where our obligations come from, in recognizing and conformity with the natural order of reason. And Regan, comes along and says, well, being self-aware is a more accurate description of what confers end in itself status. All those, and not just entities that have reason and that are autonomous, but all entities that are self-aware can only be thought of as ends in themselves. All right? So in this noumenal realm that all rational people have to observe and abide, by the rules that are contained therein, in this noumenal realm, the relationships between humans and all animals who are subjects of lives include moral dimensions, right? Because those animals who are subjects of lives have moral status. And we can't instrumentalize them in the same way that the Kantians say we can't instrumentalize other human beings, all right? And that's a very stringent, and that's why, again, remember the example of the onerous person like Donald Trump who we're going to instrumentalize because we discovered not only is he onerous and disgusting and vile and degrades our culture, but he also, amazingly, has this genetic material that if crystallized and synthesized can cure 1,000 different people, right? Still, we think, well, that's just morally wrong. He's a human being, right? So the Kantians explain why this is the case, right? They explain why not even saving 1 million human lives can justify the reduction of one human being, right? Because what's wrong? Where is the wrong identified? The wrong is identified in the reduction, not in, well, it saves lives, right? Which a lot of people think, okay, it saves lives, so let's invite, the national security state into our living rooms, right? Because it saves lives, right? At what point do you say, wait a minute, I'm a human being here, and I don't care how many lives you're saying, I want to be treated like a human being, right? Anyway, but that's the American way, right? We don't go around instrumentalizing people to benefit, to benefit the community. We're not supposed to, anyway. That's a degraded version of the USA, if that's what we're doing. Oh, let me get this attendance sheet going around. Interestingly enough, it seems as though Kalika, too. Of course, Kalika would have nothing. I mean, we don't really know much about Kalika. He might be an animal rights guy, too. He hasn't written anything about animal rights, so I kind of doubt it. But I don't think Kalika would identify anything morally wrong with harvesting the chimpanzee's heart. Interestingly enough, he might for other reasons, right? But for the reasons that he champions in his writings, he gives us no reason to condemn harvesting the chimpanzee's heart. Call it, give us no reason, right? All right. So, I guess what I'm doing here on this page of notes is I'm trying to apply these two different deontological arguments that Regan might be making to these different situations. All right, to, for example, the dolphin slaughter in Taiji Cove. Okay. So under this more permissive interpretation, then it's always okay. It's on the face of it, it's morally wrong, right? Right? On the face of it, prima facie, that's the most of Regan's argument. It's like most of Schweitzer's argument, trying to drive home the prima facie case for the moral status of some class of living beings. And so that's Regan's main project, is to demonstrate that it's on the face of it, on the face of not considering certain specifics, but at least at the outset we can assume that it's morally wrong to reduce an animal as a subject of life to fully, right? However, right, if we dig a little bit below the surface and we discover that this reduction is being done for vital human needs, then okay. Regan's going to say okay, because of the because of his two principles, right? His worse off principle and his mini ride principle, it's going to be okay to do that, all right? But that obviously leaves us plenty of room to condemn all kinds of actions that humans routinely do, and things that we routinely do in non-human animals. All right, and then the more stringent interpretation is that the fact that human interests being at stake, right? That's important, but it's only important where we have no choice but to reduce one, like in the lifeboat example, right? Here, for example, in the chimpanzee example, there's no exception, right? You can't excuse harvesting the chimpanzee's heart the way that you can excuse not harvesting, but throwing the dog overboard, okay? So, under this more stringent interpretation of Regan's argument, a chimp to human heart transplant, which necessarily involves giving the chimp, is morally impermissible. It's not allowed, right? It's morally wrong, even if the human's life is vitally dependent on using the chimp's heart, because declining to reduce the chimp to instrumental status does not involve instrumentalizing any humans. So you can imagine your Uncle Bob, being philosophically inclined and slowly coming to realize this, right? Coming to understand this argument. And then for the first time, maybe in his life, making a moral decision that didn't involve, calculation of his own interests and figuring out how to get there, right? And that might be a relief to your Uncle Bob. He might say, hey, I finally found it, thank you. And I'm going to die now because I'm not going to get this heart because I know it's morally wrong. Yes?
This doesn't necessarily mean that the chimp would survive, though, because then a different donor would take their heart.
Well, no. The question is it can we defend the practice of I wrote categorical imperative behind the screen there because I thought I wanted to remind myself that's what Kantians are after. That's a real imperative, a moral law is always a categorical imperative. It meets of no exceptions given circumstances. The contrast with categorical would be hypothetical, right? Kant thinks that utilitarianism and other moral theories give us all kinds of hypothetical imperatives, but because they're hypothetical imperatives, they don't give us any absolute guidance, and that's what he's searching for. And maybe that's, as I keep suggesting, maybe that's kind of refreshing to some people that we're not just basing our moral guidelines on some hypothetical situation that we find ourselves in right now, and then the outcome that we're seeking, right? We have obligations that are objectively evident, that are natural, right? I mean, when you let go of everything, your mind and your heart follow a natural pattern which ends up being good. Isn't that cool? That's kind of what yoga teaches us too. A lot of traditions teach us that. When you let go, and in the end, Kant, this great German rationalist, who's so inaccessible and difficult to read, in the end, maybe that's the insight that he offers about morality, right? In the end, the structures of morality become disclosed if we just let them be. We let them, reason contains within it already moral structures, okay? And so and this is a point I haven't made, but I like to make it because it's a nice analogy. Kant is a map maker. He's a cartographer. And the space that he is mapping is the space of reason, okay? And just as when the astronomer maps the universe, the astronomer is giving us a map that corresponds to the actual configuration of all the stars and planets, right? That we have, that we know, that we can see or perceive through telescopes, right? It's an accurate map. So too, Kant and the Kantians, neo-Kantians believe that humans, that Kant specifically and his followers and all the people who have, continued developing his work, are making an accurate map. They have constructed an accurate map of epistemic space, okay? And epistemic space carries with it moral relationships, right? So, and that's kind of a startling claim that Kantians make, but it's also something that many people accept too. That there are these universal laws that pertain, that have moral dimensions. All right? So let's move on here. So more specifically, how would Collicutt and Regan respond to the dolphin killing in Taiji? Collicutt would develop moral concerns at an ecosystem level, at an ecological level. All right? And Collicutt would identify the moral wrongness of the Taiji dolphin harvest as, notice I use that word harvest. Anyway. The land ethicist would be more comfortable probably with that language, whereas the animal rights advocate like Regan would be very uncomfortable by calling it a harvest. In any event, the harvest would only be morally permissible to the point where it's consistent with the marine ecosystem's capacity to repair and renew itself. Right? And these apex predators are crucial to the integrity and stability of the marine ecosystem. And so Collicutt would probably condemn the dolphin killing because of the scale at which it takes place, but he wouldn't condemn it per se. Whereas Regan and neo-Kantian animal welfare ethicists categorically reject dolphin killing in all instances. Okay? It doesn't matter. Just one. Capturing, interfering with the rights of life and liberty of a dolphin is morally wrong in every instance. Okay? Whereas with Collicutt, they wouldn't even use that kind of language. They wouldn't even talk that way, right? They would talk in terms of the consequences to the ecosystem, right? Whereas Regan, because for Regan, remember, he's an individualist. He's an axiologically, he's an individualist. Moral status is inherent to individuals. All individuals who are subjects of lives, okay? Including humans, of course. But it doesn't attach. Moral status does not attach for Regan to the ecosystem or to the biotic community. Okay, it only attaches to individuals. So Regan, of course, is going to condemn the killing of those dolphins, and he's going to condemn the sale. That's a form of that's trafficking in self-aware animals, which would be, you know, I assume. I mean, it's just morally wrong, right? We don't want to draw gradations here. It's just morally wrong. Is it the same level as morally wrong as trafficking in humans? I don't know. I should know, right? And the answer is no, it's not the same level of morally wrong. Trafficking in humans is more morally wrong. Probably. I don't know. What do you guys think? Is that holding the matriarch? They used to, most of the SeaWorld's orcas were kidnapped, taken hostage over there in Puget Sound. There are our community members. And some of them are still being held hostage, including that matriarch. She's in her 90s now, but she's the matriarch of one of those 3 pods. And she's been held hostage for, I think, 40 or 50 years now. Anyway, is that, I don't know. Is that absolutely morally wrong? That's what Regan says. That's absolutely morally wrong. And that there's just no, you know, right? They was remember the Kantians always warned the utilitarians. Woe to those who creep through the serpent windings of utilitarianism. And the minute you start going down that, you know, and start, well, right, they've got this whole infrastructure built up on keeping them captive now. Anyway, I don't know. It just seems like a tremendously wrong-headed decision to kidnap those orcas. And those ones that are still being held, it seems like they have a chance to correct themselves. I don't know. Maybe they're not healthy enough to restore to the wild. I don't know. But what is the upshot of all this? Someday, maybe, you know, we'll be more developed human beings. Let's go back to our classification system. This all breaks down, right? I mean, all of the boundaries between these different classes are porous. And there's no scientifically verifiable way to test moral status. There just isn't, right? I mean, what do you do with an individual animal whose species, all the members of her species are typically in this category, right? like a normal chimpanzee growing up in the wild. What do you do with an individual chimpanzee who's learned sign language, right? And who has communicated to humans a very high level of self-awareness and self-directedness, a rich interior life. Does that mean that those chimpanzees who know sign language are in class 5 and those chimpanzees who don't are in class 4? Maybe okay, maybe that's what that means. I don't know. But rationally, right, if you don't just want to throw up your hands and say, culture is the determinant here. And culture instructs us that all humans, even comatose humans, have rights. Culture instructs us that dolphins don't have rights. Okay? That's one answer, right? That's the relativist answer, and that kind of hangs together, actually. Relativism holds together. It's not, remember the very first day of class, I always put up egoism, nihilism, and relativism. And I always point out that these are coherent normative theories. In the sense that, they do explain the phenomena that normative theory is intended to explain. But they don't explain them to the satisfaction of most philosophers, and so most philosophers reject, all three of those orientations. But, right, you could say ultimately our classification of the moral statuses of different animals are all determined by culture. And, and so in the end, how we think about the moral status of different animals is going to be culturally determined, and there's nowhere deeper that we can go. And actually, believe it or not, that's what Collicutt says. That's what Collicutt says about ecological wholes. And so the accusation that Collicutt falls perhaps subject to is the accusation of relativism. Because he says that the kind of moral value in ecological wholes that leads culture to confer moral status, right? That's Collicutt's explanation, is that an enlightened culture confers moral status on ecological wholes, right? And that's how they get it. Rolston says, we'll read Rolston for Thursday. Rolston says, it's not that culture confers moral status on them. And if that's what you think, if that's true, if your theory is true, Mr. Collicutt, then your theory is culturally relative. And you have no way to explain to me why the people in some other society who don't accept the insights of, a society that doesn't accept the insights of ecology, that doesn't accept any environmental values at all, why should such a society confer moral rights on ecological wholes? Right? They would not have any reason to, right? Whereas Rolston says that the moral status of an ecological whole is inscribed, right? He's an objectivist. It's inscribed in the whole itself. And so a proper understanding of an ecological whole, right, leads us to accept our moral obligations, to respect and as best as we can care for that ecological whole. So anyway, right, that's the virtue of objectivism. The virtue of objectivism is it takes us out of relativism, right? Which perhaps Collicutt's too. There is a third way. There are many different ways, of course. But when we get to next week, I'll show you, I hope, how we can make our way out of this morass that we've fallen into, where we don't have to accept, we don't have to make, and that's through environmental pragmatism. Next week we'll study environmental pragmatism, even though Tom Birch does not self-identify as an environmental pragmatist, and actually he comes from this kind of Eastern philosophy, in a way, viewpoint. I read Tom Birch as an environmental pragmatist, and so we'll spend a lot of time learning about environmental pragmatism next week. And as you'll see, environmental pragmatism gives us kind of what the Neo-Kantians think they're giving us without the exotic metaphysical commitments. So those of you who are still, troubled by these various options we've been given here, right? Collicutt's prey to relativism, right? Collicutt's idea that, we need culture to confer moral status on ecological wholes. And at that point, the law catches up and the law says we have to treat them as though they have moral status, right? But in the end, the reason we're doing that is for long-term human benefit. Well, Collicutt's really confused. But anyway, what I'm trying to get you to, what I'm hoping you all come to understand after our little survey of deontological arguments, which will end finally on Thursday, and maybe it'll be a relief to all of you. But Ralston's difficult to read too. Ralston's hard. But Ralston also gives us the closest we'll get probably to what sounds like a radical, the kind of, Ralston's argument I think many of you will recognize as being the closest approximation that we've read so far of what many radical environment, including what many deep ecologists and earth firsters are saying. So, but Ralston's not a deep ecologist and he's not an earth firster either, interestingly enough. But he's up there, right? He's a neo-Kantian. And the deep ecologists are most easily read as thinkers who are happy to accept the idea that there is this noumenal realm and that we have obligations, right, that follow, that we must accept once we understand ecological relationships. We have these obligations, right? And we don't need to back it all up with an analysis of consequences, right? Because the more our obligations are embedded with the laws that ecologists have discovered, all right? But I think I'm out of. I'm done with Regan. You know, we could start getting. Ralston is so heavy. There's that Earth's atmosphere again. I kind of like that image of Earth being the size of a basketball. This would be thinner than a layer of cellophane around a basketball. There's not a lot of room up there. Okay, so a little bit of an introduction to our new friend, Holmes Ralston. He is the clearest and most developed meta-ethical objectivist that we'll read. And you know, he's the guy. If you want a thinker who offers you objective reasons to insist on preservation of biodiversity, protection of wilderness, cleaning up of the atmosphere. If you're interested in arguments for radical environmental policy proposals which are not based in appeals to long-term human welfare, then Ralston's your guy. Okay, and he's our main objectivist. He thinks that values in natural resources are objectively real, and that they're just there, and that if humans were on the scene harvesting those values or not, if humans were not on the scene at all, those values would still be there. Okay, and we can describe them objectively. All right, but yeah, he has some things in his biography. He's got a very interesting biography. He's still alive. He's in his mid-80s now, I guess, and still active. I think he doesn't teach anymore. He might guest lecture now and then, but he still writes and he goes to conferences. He's still a pretty active guy. But before he became a philosopher, before he went to graduate school in philosophy, he became a minister, Presbyterian minister, and I guess that ran in his family because both his father and grandfather were also ministers. And then he went on, had this very interesting educational trajectory. Initially got his PhD in religious studies from the University of Edinburgh in the Athens of the North, beautiful city of Edinburgh, Scotland. And then he went to the University of Pittsburgh and got a master's degree in philosophy of science. And then professionally, so I guess he never did obtain a PhD in philosophy, but he's taught philosophy from the beginning of his academic life. He's taught philosophy at Colorado State, in Fort Collins, Colorado. And interestingly enough, he delivered the Gifford Lectures. These are very prestigious. If your area of expertise as a philosopher is the philosophy of religion, then delivering the Gifford Lectures would be the most honored accomplishment that you could imagine for yourself. That would be the pinnacle of your career, right? So being invited to deliver the Gifford Lectures is a really, really, really big deal. both Holmes Rolston and his meta-ethical adversary and opponent, right? They're duking it out in the ring of philosophy, right? You got the pragmatist against the objectivist. The pragmatists, of course, are not. The pragmatists they totally reject objectivist meta-ethics. Anyway, but they both gave the Gifford lectures. William James way back in I think it was actually 1809. This was the date of his lecture at Stanford, when Gifford James gave us, and that was the year of the San Francisco earthquake. In fact, that happened while he was there. Isn't that interesting? But he gave the Gifford lectures, I think, in 1899. So it was almost exactly 100 years before Professor Rolston. But at his Stanford lecture in 1906, there are famous pictures of people standing on ladders outside the windows, because the lecture hall that he delivered his lecture in was packed. There were no more seats. In fact, there was no more room. People were standing everywhere. And then anyway, some guys went to the equipment room or whatever and got the ladders, and then they stood on the windows, looking in, because they wanted to see the great William James. Imagine, right? Imagine a society of our own country where philosophers were celebrated and were popular, were popular figures. People talked about it. I'm going to go see William James, and people actually knew what you meant. Nowadays you have to say, I'm going to go see what? I don't know. It has to be on Facebook or something. Anyway, all right. And then he also won this. This is a pretty big deal. Templeton Prize for Progress. A lot of money, which of course he donated to charity. He didn't keep any of that for himself. Anyway, pretty important guy, pretty important thing. Probably the most accomplished of all the thinkers, of all the people we encounter this term. Arguably, he's the most accomplished and achieved the most respect of his peers. And he's a brilliant writer, just absolutely brilliant. He's just a wonderful writer. But note that he's a meta-ethical objectivist. All right, values in nature and human obligations to protect these values are objectively real and objectively knowable. Okay, that is the hallmark of meta-ethical objectivism. Okay, the same way that the physical laws which pertain are objectively evident, right? Physical laws, that's what scientists go about studying. If they weren't objectively evident and couldn't be objectively described, then science would be pointless, right? The so all of us, in some sense, if you accept science at any level, then you are a physical objectivist. Okay, a physical objectivist, and you think the physical world is objectively real, and that's what science is studying, right? If you are a meta-ethical objectivist, that means you think that the moral, not only the physical laws which pertain to things in the real world, but also the moral dimensions of the laws, the moral laws that pertain between things in the universe are also objectively real and objectively knowable. Okay? In a different way, right? Not in the same way, but equally objectively real and objectively knowable. Okay? So there are different kinds of knowledge, Rolston would say. And there's scientific knowledge that's value-free, value-neutral.